Hello, lovers of God. Welcome to the next installment of our series on the sorrowful mysteries with the saints. And today we are talking about one of my favorites, St. Catherine of Siena. So if you have not watched the other ones, you could still check this out. You could still follow along. But I do recommend at some point you check out our previous episode on St. John of the Cross and the scourging at the pillar. We discussed some of the mystical pathways of his and the church, such as the purgative way. But you could still follow along in this one as well. Nonetheless, this is kind of a shorter episode because actually it's pretty straightforward how they connect. But I hope you enjoy it. I hope you share it. I hope you like and subscribe. But most of all, I hope you find some spiritual richness from this and you walk away feeling closer to Christ through his saints. God bless you and enjoy. Peace be with you and with your spirit. Welcome to another episode of St. Anthony's Tongue. I am your host, W. So over the last few weeks, we have been discussing the sorrowful mysteries of the rosary and connecting them with a saint. So this week, we will be continuing our series and we will be discussing the crowning with thorns and the great St. Catherine of Siena. But as always, let's start with the mystery. What is the crowning of thorns? Well, it's right there in the name. Everyone is likely familiar with this part of the Passion. But it happens at a very unique place. It happens after Pilate says, Ecce homo, behold the man. And here Pilate is unknowingly telling us that everything Christ is going through, he is going through on behalf of mankind. And we discussed this a little bit last episode, and that is humility and humbling. So scourging, that is meant to humble the victim, to humiliate the victim. Similarly, the crowning with thorns is supposed to do the same, but now it's a little more personal. Before, the scourging, that is done to everyone, but now this is personal. Oh, you think you're the king of the Jews? Well, wear this crown of thorns. And this ties back to something we discussed last time as well. And that is the necessity of purgation, to purge. Now we must remember the passion of the Christ. This is not just something we look at in awe and wonder, but rather, Christ is showing us our way of redemption as well. He is showing us that if we suffer and we carry our own crosses with love, that we too will resurrect and hopefully ascend into the kingdom and sit amongst the saints. So here we are being told that to start our spiritual life, we must humble ourselves. We must purge ourselves of selfishness and ego. And that is the crowning with thorns, right? The crowning with thorns is telling us that we must purge ourselves of self-importance. We must purge ourselves of thinking we are greater than everyone else. And that humility is one way that we can unite with God, right? Because the mystical pathway of the Catholic Church is right there in the Catechism, but we rarely talk about it. But it's the purgative way, which leads to the unitive way, or illuminative way, which then leads to the unitive way. So in order to unite with God, first we must purge ourselves of sinfulness, ego, and selfishness. And the crowning with thorns is part of that purgation. So it's telling us that we must purge ourselves of our self-importance. And again, as discussed last time, this is part of some of the pious paradoxes of the Catholic faith, right? And these pious paradoxes are intended to elevate our minds towards God. A virgin gives birth. A king is born not in a kingdom, but in a manger and poverty. A God humbles himself. And here, perhaps the most important is at the end of the Passion, when our God, he does not save us through living, but through dying. And here we have another pious paradox. We have a king, our king, but he does not wear a crown of gold, but he wears a crown of thorns. And he is telling us that we must wear these thorns as well in order to receive a crown of gold in the afterlife. And there was a saint who had a vision of Christ. And in that vision, he appeared holding two crowns, a crown of thorns and a crown of gold. And he told her, you can wear the crown of gold now, but be separated from me in all of eternity. Or you can wear the crown of thorns now and be united with me in eternity in the kingdom of God. And of course, she chose the crown of thorns. And I am talking about St. Catherine of Siena. So, as with all of the saints in this series, I have done plenty of episodes on them, and that includes St. Catherine of Siena. I have done multiple podcast episodes on her, so if you'd like a deep dive, feel free to check those out. But I am going to give you a very, very brief overview on her life. She was born in 1347 in Siena, Italy, and she had a vision of Christ at a very, very young age. She was going to the market with her brother, and she was going up the steps in the courtyard, and she heard the bells ringing of the church. And she looked up, and in the clouds she saw Christ, Joseph, and St. John the Evangelist. And that was her first vision, and she had visions throughout her entire life, so many to name. But she's best known for when she began to have dialogues with God. And this occurred when she was living as a third order Dominican. She was living in a order of third order women who would go and serve the sick. They would take care of the sick. In essence, they were nurses. But back then, a nurse was more of a hospice nurse, especially since this was the time of the Black Plague. But she began having these ecstatic dialogues with God, and those were eventually written down to a book called The Dialogue. And she also had just about every mystical experience you could hear or know about. Everything from the stigmata to levitation and prayer to bilocation to living only on the Eucharist to just about everything. But she was best known for her deep union with God and also giving very humble but helpful spiritual advice, so much that the Pope actually called her to go and help with the schism, because this was a time where there were the two popes. So she actually would die in Rome when going to help settle the schism. She died at only the age of 33. And she's best known kind of for her weirdness, right? She's known for drinking from the side wound of Christ and things like that. And I feel like that's great. You know, my whole thing is kind of strange Catholicism and these odd things making you elevate your mind towards God. But in doing that, we kind of overlook her theological depth. There's a concept I talk about all the time, anytime I can talk about Christian mysticism, and it comes from her. And this idea is called the gentle mirror of the soul. And in the gentle mirror of the soul, this comes from her dialogue. She tells us that our soul is supposed to mirror God. Our soul is supposed to reflect God, right? And you see that in the Magnificat, right? Magnificat anima mea Dominum. My soul reflects the greatness of God. However, over time, sinfulness, ego, selfishness, they stain that mirror. So we have to cleanse it. We have to cleanse it through purging ourselves of selfishness, ego, through the sacraments, through prayer, through penance. And the goal is to have our mirror reflect God, the mirror of our soul, rather, reflect God once more. And it's very important, and I'll tie that back with this episode in a bit, but that's one of my favorite teachings of hers, and it's kind of forgotten. But as I said before, there's a very important part in her story where she is presented with two crowns, the crown of thorns and the crown of gold, and she's told to pick one. Of course, she picks the crown of thorns, and then she has the stigmata, all 5 wounds. She was embarrassed, though, so she asked God to then make them invisible, which he did. But this really started her life of offering up her pain and suffering, something we talked about in our St. Gemma and the Agony in the Garden episode. And the other, perhaps most famous event from the life of St. Catherine of Siena is when she drank from the side wound of Christ. But many people don't know what happened before that. And that is going to really solidify this connection with the crowning with thorns. But here, St. Catherine was tending to a very angry patient, She was sick. Some stories say she had the plague, others say she had cancer. But either way, this patient was sick and suffering, and she had sores, open wounds, and pus-filled wounds all over her body. And St. Catherine had to lance some of these blisters. That's the word I was looking for. And she would go, and this woman would be completely nasty to Catherine. And then one day, Catherine asked God to help her to see God in this very difficult woman. And also to help her not see sickness and disgustingness in these these sores and blisters. And then when she was lancing, and this is going to get a little explicit, but when she was lancing this very difficult woman's blisters, a voice told her to suck out the pus of them. Now, that might seem crazy, but back in the day, when you had the plague, the idea was to get the poison out, right? So she did. She started to suck the poison, the pus, and the disgustingness out of this woman's blisters. And she said that at first she wanted to vomit, but then it tasted like honey. Now, I don't know what the woman's reaction was when she did this. But then Catherine felt that she had overcome the suffering. She had overcome the darkness. She had overcome the sickness. And now she saw sweetness in tending to this woman. It is said that after that, the woman fell asleep and the woman was cured of her cancer or the plague, whatever one it was. And then on her way home, she went into her cell in her house and she saw Christ there. And Christ then said that since you overcame the darkness, since you overcame the filth, and you saw me in the suffering, now I will let you drink from my side. And that is when she drank from the side wound of Christ. So here we see how suffering leads to redemption. And of course, no one is telling you that you need to go and suck the pus out of cancer victims' wounds. But it is saying that what we must do is we must wear these crowns of thorns in a way that leads us closer to union with God. And for St. Catherine of Siena, it was very action-based. Her crown of thorns was going and helping the sick, tending to the sick, but not just doing it to do it, but rather she would find God in doing that. It was through the suffering, it was through the pain, it was through the agony, it was through dealing with difficult patients. And there was much more in the life of St. Catherine than this. It wasn't just being a nurse. But here, it was through the suffering that she united with God. It was finding God in the lowliness and the darkness that allowed her to connect with him. Similarly, when we are suffering, when we are wearing our crowns of thorns, it means that we have humbled ourselves, we have lowered ourselves in a good way. St. Catherine did that, tending to these difficult patients, lowering herself, not seeing herself as better than, but allowing that lowliness to lead her to God. And that is the crowning with thorns. That is the crowning with thorns. Humbling ourselves to the point where we see God in the darkness. So this is kind of a straightforward one, right? The crowning with thorns is about humbling ourselves. And here, when we humble ourselves, we allow ourselves to see God more freely. This is purging. So pretty plain and simple. I do want to offer another thing when it comes to all of the mysteries. And that's the necessity of putting ourselves in the mystery, right? When we place ourselves with the crowning of thorns, yes, we must meditate upon all the times we've been mocked like Christ is being mocked. And like Christ, we are now called to forgive those people. But don't forget that when we put ourselves in those scenarios, we aren't just Christ, but sometimes we're the guards as well. Sometimes we are the guards that are mocking. We are the guards that are spitting. We are the guards that crown with thorns. And in those instances, we also need to ask God for forgiveness. But the story and life of St. Catherine of Siena is very spiritually rich. She is full of beauty and wonder. You perhaps have heard the quote from her, "Be who God intended you to be, and you will set the world on fire." But people often forget that that is tied to this gentle mirror of the soul concept before, because who is what God intended me to be? And it's that mirror of him. It's that mirror of charity, that mirror of goodness. And it starts with humbling ourselves. It starts with wearing that crown of thorns. And through that darkness, we will find light. So I hope you've enjoyed this very brief episode, because this one was pretty straightforward. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you continue with me along this series, and also check out some of my other work. Please like and subscribe, and thank you for spending time with me. God bless.